In the centuries before the rise of Islam, the Arabian Peninsula was a land of deserts and oases, of trade routes and tribal loyalties, a world that seemed distant from the great empires of Byzantium and Persia but was nonetheless shaped by them. The vast stretches of sand, broken by rocky hills and scarce water, forged a society built upon resilience and kinship. Life was organized by tribe, and allegiance to one's clan was both a matter of survival and identity. Blood ties bound people together, and disputes were settled often by custom, sometimes by violence, and occasionally by fragile truces. In this environment, honor was treasured, poetry flourished as the memory of the people, and hospitality was a sacred duty, for the desert could be cruel and only by generosity could lives be preserved. Yet beneath the rhythms of tribal existence lay tensions, between rich and poor, between the settled towns and the nomads, between the pursuit of wealth and the call of tradition. At the heart of this world stood Mecca, a small city nestled in the barren hills of the Hijaz, but one of immense importance. Its position on trade routes that linked Yemen in the south with Syria in the north made it a hub of commerce. Caravans laden with frankincense, spices, leather, and textiles passed through, bringing prosperity to the Quraysh, the dominant tribe of the city. But Mecca was not only a commercial center, it was also a religious one. At its heart stood the Kaaba, a cuboid shrine whose origins, tradition held, stretched back to Abraham and Ishmael. Over centuries it had become filled with idols representing the many deities worshipped by the tribes of Arabia. Pilgrims came from far and wide to circumambulate the shrine, offer sacrifices, and pay homage to their gods. The sanctity of the Kaaba made Mecca a place of peace, where violence was forbidden, and this sacred status added to its prosperity, for it meant that commerce and worship intertwined, bringing wealth and prestige to the Quraysh. Religion in pre-Islamic Arabia was a tapestry of beliefs. Most tribes practiced polytheism, worshipping gods and goddesses tied to nature, fate, and power. Yet there were also Jews and Christians in the peninsula, especially in towns like Yathrib and among communities in the south. Some Arabs had contact with Zoroastrianism through the Persian influence in eastern Arabia. There were also the Hanifs, individuals who rejected idols and sought to worship the one God of Abraham, though without fully following Judaism or Christianity. The presence of these different traditions meant that the Arabian Peninsula, though seemingly isolated, was in truth part of a larger web of spiritual and cultural exchange. For the Quraysh in Mecca, religion was not only a matter of faith but also of commerce, for the pilgrims who came to the Kaaba enriched the city, and any threat to its sanctity was a threat to their wealth. Economically, society was marked by sharp divisions. The Quraysh elite, who controlled trade, amassed wealth and influence, while the poor and enslaved struggled at the margins. Debt could lead to bondage, and orphans were especially vulnerable, often left without protection or inheritance. Women's position varied, while some, like Khadijah who would later marry Mohammed, could rise to wealth and influence as merchants, many others were treated as property, subject to the will of their male relatives. In some tribes, female infanticide was practiced, a tragic response to the belief that daughters were burdens. This world was one of contrasts, deep loyalty to tribe and kin, but little protection for the weak, flourishing poetry and commerce, but spiritual restlessness, honor and pride, but also injustice and cruelty. The political situation of Arabia at this time was shaped by the great powers that surrounded it. To the northwest, the Byzantine Empire extended its influence into Syria and Palestine, spreading Christianity and Roman governance. To the northeast, the Sasanian Persian Empire exerted its reach over Iraq and the Gulf, bringing Zoroastrianism and imperial politics. Yemen in the south was contested between these empires, a place where Jewish, Christian, and local Arab rulers competed for dominance. Arabia itself, however, remained largely outside direct imperial control, too fragmented by tribal divisions to be conquered outright, but too valuable as a trade route to be ignored. The tribes played these empires against each other, offering mercenary service or pledging temporary alliances, but the peninsula itself remained largely autonomous, a patchwork of tribes rather than a centralized state. Amid this landscape, the values of tribal life were both strength and weakness. Loyalty to kin gave protection, but it also fueled endless cycles of vendetta, where one killing demanded another in response, leading to feuds that could last generations. Poetry celebrated bravery in battle, generosity to guests, and fidelity to one's word, yet the same culture could glorify raiding and conquest. There was little sense of a unified people. Arabia was not a nation but a collection of clans, each fiercely independent. And yet, even within this fragmented society, there was a yearning for something more. The Hanif sought a purer faith. The poor sought justice. The tribes sought stability. It was in this world, complex and divided, that Muhammad would be born, a child who would grow to challenge its idols, its injustices, and its divisions, and in doing so would reshape not only Arabia but the entire world. For the moment, however, he was yet to enter the stage. The year was around 570 CE, remembered in tradition as the Year of the Elephant. According to accounts, this was the year when Abraha, a Christian governor of Yemen under Ethiopian rule, marched north with an army to destroy the Kaaba and redirect pilgrimage to his own cathedral. He came with elephants, mighty beasts unknown in Arabia, a show of power meant to terrify. But, as tradition tells it, his army was struck by calamity before it could reach Mecca, and the Kaaba was preserved. To the people of Mecca, this was a sign of divine protection, a reminder that their city was blessed. It was in this year, under these omens, that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born into the Hashim clan of the Quraysh, an orphan-to-be who would one day rise to challenge the very world into which he had entered. This is where the story begins, not with the man himself, but with the world that awaited him, a land of deserts and tribes, of poetry and idols, of injustice and yearning, a world poised on the brink of transformation. It is here, in the shadows of the Kaaba, in the hills around Mecca, in the fragile bonds of tribal society, that the seeds of a new faith were sown, waiting for the moment when revelation would descend and change the course of history forever. In the city of Mecca, around the year 570 CE, a child was born into the Hashim clan of the Quraysh tribe, and though his entrance into the world was quiet, his life would echo across continents and centuries. His father, Abdullah, had died before his birth, leaving him already an orphan of the father's care, a child marked by loss even at the beginning. His mother, Amina, cherished him, but her protection would not last long, and so from the very first moments of his life, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was shaped by a sense of fragility, of transience, of the need for trust beyond the ordinary bonds of family. He came into the world in Mecca, a city bustling with caravans, pilgrims, and traders, a place where his clan, though not the wealthiest, carried respect for its role in caring for the Kaaba and providing water for pilgrims. His family was neither poor nor among the richest of the Quraysh, but they belonged to a lineage held in esteem, for they traced their ancestry to Abraham through Ishmael, and their honor came not only from wealth but from tradition and service. As was the custom of the Arabs at the time, Muhammad was entrusted for a period of his infancy to a wet nurse from the Bedouin tribes who lived in the desert surrounding Mecca. This practice was believed to strengthen children, for the desert was considered purer than the city, the air cleaner, the language spoken more refined. It was with Halima al-Sa'diyya of the Banu Sa'd tribe that Muhammad spent some of his earliest years. Halima and her family would later recall how, after Muhammad entered their care, their fortunes seemed to improve, their animals gave more milk, their land seemed to yield more blessing, and they felt that there was something extraordinary in this child, though he was quiet, gentle, and small. Among the stories told of this time is the account that, while playing with other children, Muhammad was approached by two figures in white who opened his chest, removed something dark from within, and cleansed his heart with pure water before returning it. While believers understood this as a miraculous sign of his purity and preparation for future prophecy, others saw it as a story that reflected the sense, even in his childhood, that this was no ordinary boy. After a few years, Muhammad returned to the care of his mother, but his childhood continued to be marked by loss. When he was 6 years old, Amina set out with him on a journey to visit relatives in Yathrib, later known as Medina. On the way back, however, she fell ill and died at a place called Abwa, leaving Muhammad now a full orphan, without either father or mother to protect him. He was brought back to Mecca under the care of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, a respected elder of the Quraysh who had long been custodian of the Kaaba. Abdul Muttalib loved the boy dearly, and it is said he gave him a place of honor near his seat by the Kaaba, though Muhammad was still a child. Yet only 2 years later, when Muhammad was 8, Abdul Muttalib too passed away, and guardianship of the boy fell to his uncle Abu Talib. Abu Talib was not wealthy, but he was honorable and protective, and he raised Muhammad among his own children with affection. It was under Abu Talib's roof that Muhammad grew into adolescence, learning the ways of his tribe, the poetry and traditions of the Arabs, and the duties of loyalty to kin. He began to work as a shepherd, tending the flocks of Meccans for small wages. In those quiet hours among the hills, he came to know solitude and contemplation, the vast sky above him, the stillness of the desert shaping his character with patience and humility. The life of a shepherd was hard, but it gave him a closeness to nature, an independence of spirit, and a sense of responsibility for those entrusted to his care. Later in life, he would speak of the virtues of shepherding, of how every prophet, he said, had tended flocks, as if the labor itself prepared the heart for guidance. As he grew older, Muhammad accompanied Abu Talib on caravan journeys, traveling north toward Syria. These journeys introduced him to the broader world beyond Mecca, to the bustling markets of Damascus, to the diverse peoples who lived under Byzantine rule, to Jews and Christians whose scriptures spoke of prophets and revelations. In one account, during such a journey, a Christian monk named Bahira is said to have recognized signs of prophecy in the boy, though such stories would be remembered with greater significance only later, when his mission had begun. What mattered most at the time was that Muhammad gained experience in trade, learning honesty in dealings, patience in negotiation, and the rhythms of travel that would later shape his adult life. Through his youth, Muhammad's reputation grew. Among his peers he was known for truthfulness, humility, and a character that stood apart in a society often marred by boastfulness or deceit. He avoided the excesses of his contemporaries, refraining from drinking, gambling, or worshipping idols, and though he lived in a society immersed in polytheism, he seemed always inclined to something more pure, something beyond the images of stone and wood. His honesty earned him the nickname Al-Amin, the trustworthy, a title that would follow him throughout his life and prove essential when he began to speak of revelation. People trusted Muhammad because he had never lied, never betrayed, never failed in his word. Yet for all his character, his early years were still marked by vulnerability. He had no father to guide him, no wealth to secure his place among the Quraysh elite. He was dependent on the protection of his uncle, and though Abu Talib was devoted, his own means were limited. Muhammad knew from an early age the precariousness of life, the fragility of security, the loneliness of loss. These experiences shaped his empathy for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the marginalized, themes that would become central to his message when revelation came. In him, hardship did not breed bitterness but compassion, and his childhood left him with a deep awareness of those who lived without power. As he reached manhood, Muhammad's character was well known among the Quraysh. He participated in the Hilf al-Feudal, a pact formed by several clans of Mecca to protect the rights of the oppressed and ensure justice in the city. This alliance, which pledged to stand against injustice even if the victim was a foreigner, reflected a sense of moral duty that resonated with Muhammad's own inclinations. Years later, after he became a prophet, he would recall the pact with admiration, saying that if he were called to such an agreement again, he would respond. It was an early sign that his heart leaned toward justice, fairness, and the defense of those who had no defenders. His youth, then, was a mixture of hardship and respect, of loss and growth. He was an orphan who found protection in his family, a shepherd who learned patience, a trader who gained a reputation for honesty, a man of modest means who nonetheless earned admiration for his character. He was not yet a prophet, not yet a leader, not yet the figure who would change the course of history, but all the qualities that would define him were already visible. His honesty, his empathy, his perseverance, his spiritual restlessness, his integrity in the face of a society often shaped by greed and pride, all these took root in the years before his mission began. In Mecca, the Kaaba still stood filled with idols, pilgrims still came with offerings, the Quraysh still prospered from their guardianship of the shrine. The city bustled with trade, yet beneath the surface, injustices persisted, the poor remained oppressed, and spiritual hunger lingered. In this world, Muhammad grew into adulthood, a man already set apart by the purity of his character, prepared by hardship, waiting for the moment when his destiny would unfold and his message would be revealed. As Muhammad entered his 20s, the reputation he had built as a young man of honesty, humility, and reliability began to open doors in Mecca that were otherwise closed to those without great wealth or lineage. He was still known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, and his reputation for fairness in trade spread among the merchants and caravan leaders of the Quraysh. In a city where commerce determined power, a man without riches but with integrity could still find a path upward, and Muhammad's path came through the caravans he managed with remarkable skill. Word of his honesty reached Khadija, a wealthy widow and respected merchant who managed large trading ventures. Unlike many women of her time, Khadija had inherited and successfully expanded her business after the deaths of her father and husband. She was admired for her intelligence and independence, and she often employed capable men to lead caravans on her behalf. When she heard of Muhammad's reputation, she entrusted him with one of her most important trading expeditions north to Syria. Muhammad accepted the responsibility with seriousness, joining the caravan and demonstrating not only competence but scrupulous honesty in every deal. When he returned, Khadija's profits had increased beyond expectation, and the accounts showed no trace of manipulation or dishonesty. She was impressed not only by his skill but by his integrity, and she listened as her servant, who had accompanied Muhammad, told her of his conduct along the journey, how he treated others with fairness, avoided disputes, and carried himself with dignity. In an environment where deception and sharp bargaining were common, Muhammad's honesty set him apart. Khadija, though about 15 years older than Muhammad, saw in him not only a man of reliability but one of deep character. According to tradition, she proposed marriage to him, an extraordinary gesture that reflected both her independence and the esteem in which she held him. Muhammad accepted, and their union became one of warmth, stability, and partnership. Unlike many men of his society, Muhammad remained monogamous during Khadija's lifetime, and their marriage endured for nearly 25 years until her death. She provided him with comfort, wealth, and a stable household, while he gave her loyalty, respect, and affection. Together they had several children, including daughters Zainab, Ruqayya, Kulthum, and Fatima. Their sons died in infancy, a sorrow that weighed upon them both, but the bond between them grew ever stronger through shared joys and losses. Their marriage also offered Muhammad a new place in Meccan society. Through Khadija's support, he gained financial stability, allowing him to spend more time in reflection and contemplation. Though he continued to manage trade and provide for his household, his life was no longer consumed by the struggle for survival. Instead, he could observe more deeply the inequities of Meccan society. The arrogance of the wealthy elite, the suffering of the poor, the oppression of orphans and slaves. He was unsettled by the idolatry that dominated the Kaaba, the rituals that seemed hollow, and the exploitation he saw around him. Yet he did not rebel openly. He remained quiet, pensive, often withdrawing into solitude to think. Khadija supported his reflective nature, offering him understanding and space to seek meaning. She valued his honesty and his kindness, and she provided him with a household where trust and companionship flourished. Their relationship is remembered not only as a marriage of affection but also as one of spiritual partnership, for when the time came that Muhammad received his first revelation, it was Khadija who stood by him without hesitation, believing in him when he himself was shaken. In his years as a husband and father, Muhammad's character became ever more admired in Mecca. He settled disputes when asked, acting as an arbitrator because people trusted his judgment. One of the most well-known incidents from this period was the rebuilding of the Kaaba after it had been damaged by flooding. When the tribes of Quraysh argued over who would have the honor of placing the black stone in its position, tempers rose, and violence threatened. To resolve the conflict, they agreed to let the next man who entered the sanctuary decide. That man was Muhammad. With calm wisdom, he spread out a cloth, placed the black stone upon it, and asked representatives of each tribe to lift the corners together, carrying the stone to its place. Then he himself guided it into position. The solution satisfied all parties, and once again he proved himself as a man of peace, fairness, and insight. Through these years, Muhammad did not involve himself deeply in the politics of the Quraysh elite, nor did he pursue wealth for its own sake. He lived modestly, often giving to those in need. Though he was respected, he was not among the most powerful. Yet he was deeply aware of the injustices that surrounded him. He saw the way the rich grew richer while the poor were cast aside. He saw women mistreated, orphans unprotected, slaves abused. He saw idols carved from stone and wood being worshipped as gods, while the memory of Abraham's pure monotheism was almost forgotten. These observations weighed heavily upon him, stirring questions that found no easy answer. To seek solace, Muhammad began to retreat into periods of solitude. He would spend nights in the cave of Hira, a small cavern in the mountains outside Mecca, where he prayed and reflected upon creation, upon the nature of life, upon the injustice he witnessed. These retreats were not yet revelation, but they revealed the depth of his spiritual longing. He was searching, as the Hanifs had searched, for something greater than the idols of his people, something more enduring than the wealth of merchants, something purer than the customs of his tribe. His life in this period was steady, defined by his role as husband, father, merchant, and respected member of Meccan society. Yet there was within him a restlessness, a yearning that nothing in his world could satisfy. He was a man of peace living in a society torn by inequality, a man of truth surrounded by idolatry, a man of compassion amid cruelty. All the experiences of his youth, the loss of his parents, the protection of his uncle, the honesty that earned him trust, the partnership of Khadijah, the injustices he observed, prepared him for what was to come. His life to this point had been one of integrity, but soon it would take a turn that would transform him from a merchant of Mecca into a messenger of God, and in doing so would alter the course of history forever. As the years passed in Mecca, Muhammad's reputation remained steady as a man of honesty, modesty, and compassion, yet he grew ever more restless within his heart. The bustling city, filled with the clamor of trade and the bustle of pilgrims, could not quiet the unease he felt at the injustices he witnessed. He saw the wealthy elite boasting of their fortunes while the poor begged at their doors. He saw idols of stone and wood elevated as gods, while orphans and widows were neglected. He saw people swearing oaths by deities who could not answer them, shedding blood for trivial reasons, and disregarding the weak as if they did not matter. It weighed upon him, for from childhood he had known what it was to be vulnerable and unprotected, and his spirit longed for truth and meaning beyond the ways of his people. In these years, he began to spend more time in seclusion, retreating into the quiet hills outside of Mecca where the noise of the city could not reach him. His place of retreat was a small cave in the mountain of Hira, a cavern overlooking the valley, where he could sit alone and contemplate creation. There, under the vast sky, he would spend hours, sometimes nights, in meditation. He thought of the stars that shone with a brilliance untouched by human hands, of the mountains that stood unmoving through centuries, of the wind that passed over the desert in silence. He thought of the stories he had heard of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, prophets of earlier times who called people to the worship of one God. He thought of the Hanifs, the seekers among his people who rejected idols and searched for the pure faith of Abraham. He thought of the injustices in Mecca and of the fragility of life itself, remembering his own childhood as an orphan and the losses he had endured. Alone in the cave, his heart grew more attuned to the possibility that there was something beyond what men carved with their hands, something greater than the wealth and pride of his tribe. It was during one of these retreats, when he was about 40 years old, that the moment came which would change his life and the life of the world. As he sat in the stillness of the cave, suddenly the silence was broken by the presence of a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The angel Jibreel, known to Christians and Jews as Gabriel, appeared before him, filling the space with a presence that was overwhelming and undeniable. Muhammad felt fear grip him, for this was no dream, no imagination, this was something greater, something beyond the ordinary. The angel spoke, commanding him with a single word, "Read." Muhammad, unlettered, replied that he could not read. Again the command came, "Read." Again he responded that he could not. A third time the angel pressed upon him with overwhelming force and said, "Read in the name of your Lord who created men from a clot of blood. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught men what he did not know." These were the first verses of the Qur'an revealed, the beginning of the message that would continue for 23 years. Terrified, trembling, and unsure of what had happened, Muhammad fled from the cave, his heart pounding. He descended the mountain and rushed home to Khadijah, calling for her to cover him, for he feared he had gone mad or been possessed. She wrapped him in a cloak and listened as he poured out his account of what had happened, his voice shaken with fear. Far from doubting him, Khadijah believed. She reassured him, reminding him of his honesty, his care for the poor, his kindness to kin, his fairness in disputes. "God would not disgrace you," she said, "for you uphold family ties, you bear the burdens of the weak, you help the poor and needy, you honor the guest, and you support the truth. Seeking further confirmation, she took him to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, an elderly man who had studied the scriptures of the Jews and Christians. When he heard Muhammad's account, Waraka declared that this was the same messenger who had come to Moses, and that Muhammad was called to be a prophet to his people. For Muhammad, this was both reassurance and a burden. He knew now that what he had experienced was not madness, but a calling. Yet the weight of it pressed heavily upon him. The first revelation did not bring him triumph but fear and humility. He withdrew again, unsure of how to carry such a responsibility, until further revelations came, urging him to rise and warn, to call his people to the worship of one God. Thus began his mission as a prophet, a mission that would test him, challenge him, and transform his life completely. In the early days, the revelations came with intensity, filling his heart and mind with words that flowed like fire, words he knew were not his own but were placed upon his tongue by divine command. They spoke of God's oneness, of creation, of the day of judgment, of the need for justice and compassion. They condemned idolatry, arrogance, and oppression, and they called people to worship God alone. The words were unlike the poetry of the Arabs, surpassing its eloquence and rhythm, carrying a power that could not be denied. Those who heard them recognized their force, even if they resisted their meaning. At first, Muhammad shared these revelations only with those closest to him. Khadijah was the first to believe, standing by him with unwavering faith. His young cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib, who lived in his household, also accepted the message, as did his freed servant Zayd ibn Haritha and his friend Abu Bakr, a respected merchant. These early converts formed the first community of Islam, small but devoted, praying together in secret, reciting the words of the Qur'an, and strengthening one another against the doubts that surrounded them. Muhammad, once known simply as Al-Amin, now carried a responsibility beyond what anyone could have imagined. He was no longer only a husband, a father, a merchant, a mediator. He was a messenger of God, entrusted with words that would challenge the foundations of his society. He did not seek this role, nor did he desire power or riches from it, but he could not deny the call he had received. The quiet men who had retreated into solitude now bore a message that would spread from the cave of Hira to the entire world, beginning with whispered prayers in Mecca and ending with a faith that would transcend tribes, nations, and centuries. The first revelations Muhammad received in the cave of Hira marked a profound turning point, but in those early years the mission remained quiet, careful, almost hidden. He did not stand before the Quraysh and proclaim his message at once, for he knew well the opposition it would provoke. Instead, he began with those closest to him, those he trusted most deeply. Khadijah, who had been the first to believe in him, remained his unwavering supporter, comforting him whenever the burden of revelation seemed too heavy. His young cousin Ali, still a boy living under Muhammad's care, prayed beside him without hesitation. Zayd ibn Haritha, his freed servant who had long been devoted to him, declared his loyalty not only as a companion but as a believer in his message. Abu Bakr, respected among the Quraysh for his wisdom and generosity, became one of the earliest and most important followers, using his influence to bring others into the faith. These first believers formed a small circle, gathering quietly to pray, recite the revealed verses, and affirm their faith in one God. In the beginning, their prayers and recitations were done in secret, in houses away from the eyes of those who might scorn or attack them. The words of revelation came slowly, sometimes filling Muhammad with awe and fear, sometimes bringing him solace and strength. They spoke of God's power as creator, of the responsibility of humankind to worship him alone, of the coming day of judgment when all would be held accountable for their deeds. They urged compassion for the poor, care for orphans, justice in dealings, honesty in speech, and humility before God. These words, though recited softly among the small group of believers, carried with them a force that unsettled the order of Mecca, for if taken seriously they would upend the wealth and idols upon which the Quraysh elite had built their authority. As the community grew slowly, others began to notice. The Quraysh were accustomed to many religious voices in their city, for Mecca was home to idols of countless tribes. But Muhammad's message was different. It did not call for one God among many, but for one God alone, denying the power of every idol in the Kaaba. To the poor and the enslaved, this message carried hope, for it declared that in the sight of God all were equal, and that the arrogance of the wealthy would not shield them on the day of judgment. To the elites, however, it was a threat, for it struck at the very foundation of their influence. If the idols were nothing, then the Quraysh's guardianship of the Kaaba as a sanctuary for them was meaningless. If wealth and pride were condemned, then their way of life stood under judgment. Yet at first, Muhammad did not challenge them directly. For nearly 3 years he called only those he trusted, quietly inviting them to the faith. More men and women joined, among them Uthman ibn Affan, a merchant of noble birth, Abdurrahman ibn Awf, a generous trader, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, a skilled warrior, and Bilal ibn Rabah, an Ethiopian slave whose conversion would become a symbol of Islam's embrace of the oppressed. Together they prayed, learning new verses as they were revealed, strengthening one another in a society that soon began to turn against them. In time, however, the command came for Muhammad to proclaim his message more openly. No longer could it remain confined to whispers and secret gatherings. He began with his own clan, calling them together and warning them of the consequences of idolatry and injustice, urging them to worship God alone. Many scoffed, some laughed, others turned away in anger, but a few listened. Then he expanded his call to the Quraysh more broadly, speaking in public, reciting the verses revealed to him. Now the opposition began in earnest. The Quraysh mocked him, calling him a poet, a madman, a sorcerer. They jeered at the promise of resurrection and judgment, asking who would raise their ancestors' bones from dust. They dismissed his warnings and derided his message, but they could not ignore it. His words carried a power unlike any they had heard before, and though they resisted, they could not silence him. The first to suffer for their faith were not the powerful but the weak. Slaves and the poor who embraced Islam found themselves beaten, starved, and tormented by their masters. Bilal was dragged into the scorching sun, pinned beneath stones, ordered to renounce his belief, but he refused, repeating only, "One." Others endured torture, and some, like Sumaya bint Kababab, were killed, becoming the first martyrs of Islam. Muhammad himself was shielded for a time by the protection of his uncle Abu Talib, who though not a believer, defended him out of family loyalty. But as the numbers of Muslims slowly grew, the hostility of the Quraysh intensified. They saw their idols insulted, their authority undermined, their traditions challenged, and they plotted ways to suppress this new faith. Yet despite the opposition, the message spread. Some were drawn by the beauty of the Qur'an's words, its rhythm and eloquence unlike the poetry of men. Others were moved by the character of Muhammad himself, who lived as he preached, showing kindness, fairness, and patience even toward those who mocked him. His home remained modest, his dealings honest, his prayers constant. In him, people saw not only a preacher but an example, a man whose life gave weight to his words. The early years in Mecca were filled with both hope and hardship. The believers were few, their gatherings secret, their position precarious. They faced scorn, violence, and the threat of expulsion. Yet they also experienced the strength of faith, the unity of a small community bound not by tribe or wealth but by belief in one God. In these years, the foundations of Islam were laid, not in grand conquests or public triumphs, but in whispered prayers in the night, in steadfastness under persecution, in the courage of men and women who believed despite all odds. For Muhammad, these years were a test of patience and perseverance. He had not sought leadership, yet he was now at the center of a struggle that grew more intense with each revelation. His role was not only to receive and convey the words of God, but to nurture a community that embodied them, to guide men and women who were learning to live in a way their society could not understand. The opposition of the Quraysh was fierce, but the small circle of believers held fast, their faith deepening with every hardship they endured. In the hidden corners of Mecca, a movement was growing, one that would one day transform the city itself and then the entire world. As the message of Islam slowly spread in Mecca, the hostility of the Quraysh deepened into something more organized and menacing. What had begun as mockery and ridicule soon became a campaign of pressure, intimidation, and violence. The Quraysh could not deny that Muhammad was a man of honesty and fairness. They had long called him Al-Amin, but now they saw him as a threat to everything that secured their position. His call to worship one God alone was not merely a spiritual challenge, it struck at the heart of their society. The idols of the Kaaba were not only objects of devotion but the center of Mecca's economy. Pilgrims from across Arabia came to honor them, bringing trade and wealth that sustained the Quraysh elite. If Muhammad's message prevailed, those idols would be cast aside, and with them the influence of the Quraysh would collapse. This was more than religion, it was power, prestige, and livelihood. In the face of this, the Quraysh turned to direct opposition. They first tried persuasion. The leaders approached Muhammad with promises of wealth, status, and leadership if only he would abandon his call. They offered him kingship, riches, and even a compromise. He could worship their gods part of the year if they would worship his god the other part. But Muhammad refused with calm resolve. His loyalty to the message entrusted to him was absolute. If they placed the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, he said, I would not abandon this cause. His refusal infuriated the Quraysh, for it showed them that he could not be bought, could not be swayed by the temptations that bound so many others. When persuasion failed, they resorted to mockery and accusation. They called him a poet weaving verses to impress the simple, a magician casting spells to divide families, a madman tormented by spirits. Yet even their accusations revealed their unease, for they could not agree on one label. The words of the Qur'an were unlike anything they had heard, too eloquent to be madness, too powerful to be poetry, too consistent to be sorcery. Their very inability to explain it showed that something deeper was at work. As the believers grew in number, the Quraysh began to target the most vulnerable among them. Slaves and the poor bore the brunt of persecution. Bilal was stretched on the hot sands, pinned under stones, ordered to renounce his faith, yet he persisted with the cry of one. Yasir and his wife Sumaya, among the earliest Muslims, were tortured cruelly. Sumaya was killed with a spear, becoming the first martyr in Islam. Others were beaten, starved, and imprisoned. Those with family protection fared better, but none were entirely safe. Even Muhammad himself was insulted and humiliated, his path littered with thorns, ashes thrown upon his head, his prayers mocked in the sanctuary of the Kaaba. Yet through it all, he bore the insults with patience, responding not with violence but with steadfastness, urging his followers to endure. The Quraysh, frustrated by the resilience of Muhammad and his followers, sought to isolate them completely. They declared a social boycott against the Muslims and their supporters, forbidding marriage, trade, and all dealings with them. This boycott extended not only to the believers but also to the clan of Banu Hashim, for though not all of them were Muslims, their loyalty to Muhammad as one of their own bound them to his fate. The Muslims and their kin were driven to a valley on the edge of Mecca, known as the Valley of Abu Talib, where they lived in hardship for nearly 3 years. Supplies were cut off, and they endured hunger so severe that the cries of children echoed through the night. Leaves and dry grass became their food, and only the occasional secret delivery from sympathetic Meccans sustained them. The Quraysh believed this pressure would break Muhammad's resolve, but it did not. He continued to preach, to recite the verses revealed to him, to guide his community in patience and faith. This period became known as one of the most difficult in the early history of Islam. It tested the loyalty of the believers and the bonds of kinship. Some wavered, but many remained steadfast, their suffering only deepening their conviction that the message they had embraced was true. For Muhammad, it was a time of immense sorrow, for he bore not only his own hunger but the sight of his followers, the weakest and most vulnerable, suffering because of their faith in him. Yet he did not abandon them or seek an easier path. His trust in God remained unshaken. In the midst of these trials, however, the message of Islam continued to spread. Quietly, some among the Quraysh were moved by the verses of the Qur'an, their hearts stirred despite their pride. Others witnessed the perseverance of the Muslims and wondered what faith could inspire such endurance. The boycott, intended to crush Islam, instead highlighted the depth of its followers' devotion. Eventually, some among the Quraysh themselves grew uneasy with the cruelty of the boycott, and after nearly 3 years it was brought to an end. The Muslims and their kin were allowed to return to Mecca, though the hostility did not fade. For Muhammad, these years were a preparation for even greater trials. They showed him who would remain loyal through suffering, who would stand firm under persecution. They taught the community patience, resilience, and unity, qualities they would need in the struggles ahead. They also revealed the limits of compromise. The Quraysh had offered wealth, status, and protection, but Muhammad had refused, holding firmly to the truth of his message. The years of hardship in the valley became a crucible that refined the believers, turning them from a fragile group into a community bound by shared sacrifice and faith. The Quraysh had sought to extinguish the light of this new message, but instead it burned more brightly, carried in the hearts of men and women who had suffered for it. Though they remained small in number, their endurance laid a foundation that no persecution could break. Muhammad, who had once been the quiet and trusted al-Amin, was now a figure around whom the city was divided, loved by some, hated by others, but impossible to ignore. The opposition had failed to silence him, and in their failure, the Quraysh had only set the stage for the next chapter of his mission, one that would take him beyond Mecca and into the wider world. The years of hardship during the boycott left deep marks upon the small community of Muslims, and though they emerged from the valley alive, the trials were far from over. Not long after their return to Mecca, Muhammad was struck by the greatest sorrows of his life up to that time, a period remembered as the Year of Sorrow. In the space of months, he lost two of the dearest people who had sustained him through the early years of his mission, his beloved wife Khadija and his protective uncle Abu Talib. Their deaths brought not only personal grief but also profound consequences for his mission, leaving him more vulnerable than ever to the hostility of the Quraysh. Khadija had been more than a wife to Muhammad. She had been his confidant, his partner, and his greatest supporter. From the first terrifying moment when he had returned from the cave of Hira, trembling and uncertain, she had believed in him without hesitation. She had comforted him when he doubted, reassured him when he feared, and stood beside him when others mocked and rejected him. Her wealth had sustained him and his followers during the years of hardship, and her presence had been a constant source of stability. When she died, Muhammad lost not only his closest companion but the woman who had given him strength in the darkest hours. Her absence left a void in his heart that could not be filled, and though he would marry again in later years, none could take the place of Khadija in his affections. He would remember her always with tenderness, speaking her name with reverence, honoring her memory even when others grew jealous of the love he still carried for her. Soon after Khadija's death came the loss of Abu Talib, the uncle who had raised him after his grandfather's passing, who had protected him as a child and stood as his guardian into adulthood. Though Abu Talib had never accepted Islam, his loyalty to Muhammad as a nephew had been unshakable. It was Abu Talib's position within the Quraysh that had shielded Muhammad from the worst of their hostility, for the customs of tribal honor prevented them from killing a man under the protection of his clan chief. With Abu Talib's death, that protection was gone, and Muhammad found himself exposed to dangers he had long been spared. The Quraysh, no longer restrained by Abu Talib's influence, intensified their hostility, insulting and harassing him openly, plotting against his life, emboldened by his weakened position. The loss of Khadija and Abu Talib in such close succession weighed heavily upon Muhammad. Grief and vulnerability pressed upon him, yet he did not falter in his mission. Still, the pain drove him to seek support elsewhere, to look beyond Mecca for allies who might offer him protection and a place where his message could take root. It was during this time that he traveled to the city of Taif, hoping to find there a community receptive to his call. He journeyed with the hope that the people of Taif might embrace the message or at least provide him refuge from the hostility of his own tribe. But his reception there was harsh. The leaders rejected him, mocking his words, and set the street children and rabble upon him to drive him out. Stones were hurled at him until his feet bled, and he was forced to flee the city bruised and humiliated. Yet even in that moment of despair, Muhammad did not turn his heart against those who had mistreated him. Instead, he raised his voice in prayer, asking only that God guide them, for perhaps their children would believe if not they themselves. His endurance in suffering, his refusal to curse those who harmed him, revealed the depth of his character. It was not anger but compassion that shaped his response, and though he left Taif rejected, his mission was not broken. This period of loss and rejection could have ended his resolve, yet instead it marked a turning point. Out of grief came new openings, and out of rejection came new visions of possibility. According to tradition, it was during this time that the miraculous night journey occurred, when Muhammad was taken by night from the Kaaba to Jerusalem, and from there ascended through the heavens. On this journey, he encountered earlier prophets, Moses, Jesus, Abraham, affirming the continuity of his message with theirs. At the highest point, he came into the presence of God, receiving instructions for his community, most notably the obligation of prayer, which would become the central act of devotion in Islam. This vision, though mysterious and wondrous, gave him renewed strength and a deeper sense of his role as the messenger of God. In Mecca, however, the hostility did not diminish. Without Khadijah to comfort him and Abu Talib to shield him, Muhammad's situation was precarious. Yet it was also in these years that his message began to reach beyond the narrow confines of the Quraysh. During the annual pilgrimage season, when tribes from across Arabia gathered in Mecca, Muhammad spoke to strangers who came from distant towns. Some of these men from the city of Yathrib listened with open hearts, carrying his words back to their people. Their openness would soon provide the refuge Muhammad sought, though he did not yet know it. Thus, the year of sorrow was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of Muhammad's life with Khadijah, the end of the protection Abu Talib had given him, the end of any illusions that his message would find acceptance in Mecca's elite. Yet it was also the beginning of Islam's spread beyond Mecca, the beginning of new alliances, the beginning of visions that reassured him of his divine mission. In his grief, he learned patience. In his vulnerability, he learned trust. In his rejection, he found the path that would lead him to Medina and to the transformation of his small, persecuted community into a people bound by faith. The losses he suffered were personal and searing, yet they deepened his humanity, making him a leader who understood sorrow as well as triumph. He had endured hunger, insult, loss, and rejection, and through it all his heart remained steadfast. The prophet who had once been shielded now stood exposed, yet in his endurance lay the seed of strength that would carry him and his followers through the struggles yet to come. The sorrow that weighed upon Muhammad after the loss of Khadijah and Abu Talib never left him entirely, but even in that grief, new doors began to open. The Quraysh remained hardened in their opposition, refusing to listen, and many in Mecca still mocked and harassed the small community of Muslims, but the annual pilgrimage season brought visitors from all across Arabia to the Kaaba. These were men and women from distant tribes who came to perform rituals, settle disputes, and engage in trade. Muhammad saw in these gatherings an opportunity. Though his own people rejected him, perhaps others might listen. Quietly, he began to approach small groups of pilgrims, reciting to them verses of the Qur'an, speaking of one God, of justice, of compassion for the weak, and of the day of judgment. Most dismissed him quickly, but a few were struck by his words, especially men from a city to the north known as Yathrib. Yathrib was a city divided, home to two main Arab tribes, Aws and Khazraj, who had been locked in bitter rivalry for generations, their feuds erupting into violence time and again. Alongside them lived several Jewish tribes who spoke of the coming of a prophet who would restore justice and faith. The people of Yathrib were weary of conflict, weary of the cycles of vengeance, and some began to see in Muhammad a possible source of peace. They heard his words and saw in them an answer to the strife that had long plagued their city. On one occasion, a small group of men from Yathrib listened to him with openness, and when they returned to their city, they spread his message quietly among their kin. The following year, during the pilgrimage, more men from Yathrib sought him out, curious about this man who spoke of one God and the need for unity. They pledged to believe in him and to abandon the sins of their past, promising not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to kill their children, and to obey him in righteousness. This became known as the First Pledge of Aqaba, a quiet but momentous step, for it signaled the first formal commitment of people beyond Mecca to Muhammad and his message. They returned to Yathrib determined to spread his teachings, and soon Islam began to take root in a city that had been torn by division. By the next year, the interest in Yathrib had grown. A larger group, including leaders of both Aws and Khazraj, met with Muhammad secretly at night during the pilgrimage. They listened carefully as he recited the Qur'an, and their hearts were moved. They recognized in him not only a prophet but a leader who could bring peace to their city. This meeting became the second pledge of Aqaba. They swore loyalty to him, promising to protect him as they would their own families if he came to live among them. They invited him to Yathrib, offering a refuge for him and his followers, and in that moment the path toward migration, the Hijra, was set. The pledges of Aqaba gave the Muslims a glimmer of hope in their darkest days. Mecca had become a place of danger and hostility, but Yathrib offered safety and a future. Muhammad instructed his followers to begin migrating quietly, leaving behind their homes, their possessions, even their families if necessary, to find refuge in the new city. One by one, small groups slipped away, making the long journey north, some under cover of night, others openly despite the risks. For those who had been persecuted, beaten, and starved in Mecca, the journey was an act of liberation. For those left behind, it was an act of sacrifice, for they abandoned the city of their birth for the sake of faith. The Quraysh watched with growing alarm as more and more Muslims left. They feared that if Muhammad established a base in Yathrib, he would grow in power and return to challenge them. Their hatred reached a point where they plotted not only to suppress him but to end his life. Leaders from different clans gathered to devise a plan. They would take one young man from each clan to strike Muhammad together, so that no single tribe could be held responsible for his blood. They believed this would eliminate him once and for all, scattering his followers and extinguishing his movement. But before they could act, Muhammad received word of their plot, and it was revealed to him that the time had come for him to leave Mecca as well. The night of his departure was one of danger. He left his home quietly, slipping away under the cover of darkness, while his cousin Ali remained in his bed, risking his life to mislead the assassins who had surrounded the house. With his companion Abu Bakr, Muhammad set out on the perilous journey north, pursued by Quraysh riders who sought to capture him. For several days they hid in the cave of Thor, where, according to tradition, a spider spun its web and a pigeon built its nest at the entrance, convincing their pursuers that no one could be inside. From there, they continued their journey through the desert, sustained by faith, until at last they reached the outskirts of Yathrib. When Muhammad entered the city, he was greeted not as a stranger but as a leader and a peacemaker. The people of Yathrib welcomed him, and the city became known thereafter as Medina, the city of the Prophet. It was here that the Muslim community would take root, no longer scattered and vulnerable, but united and organized. The Hijra marked not only a change of place but a new chapter in history. It was the beginning of the Islamic calendar, the moment when Islam shifted from being a persecuted faith of a small group in Mecca to a community with a home, a leader, and a future. For Muhammad, the pledges of Aqaba and the migration to Medina were both a relief and a responsibility. He now carried the hopes of not only his followers but of a city that looked to him for justice and peace. His mission was no longer to endure persecution in Mecca but to build a new society in Medina, one guided by revelation, where the bonds of faith would transcend the divisions of tribe, wealth, and lineage. The path ahead would still be filled with trials, conflicts, betrayals, and struggles, but in Medina, Islam would become more than a belief whispered in secret. It would become a community, a way of life, and a force that would shape the world. When Muhammad finally arrived in Yathrib after the perilous journey from Mecca, the city was alive with anticipation. Word of his coming had spread quickly among the people, and crowds gathered to greet him. Families came out from their homes, lining the streets, calling out in joy, offering him shelter, and singing songs of welcome. For them, he was not only a prophet bringing a new faith but also a leader who might bring peace to a city long divided by blood feuds. The Aws and Khazraj, the two main tribes of Yathrib, had endured years of conflict, and though their leaders had sworn to protect Muhammad when they met him at Aqaba, the question remained whether their pledges would hold true once he lived among them. But the enthusiasm of the people was undeniable, and Muhammad entered the city with humility, allowing his camel to wander freely until it knelt on a piece of land that would become the site of his mosque. This moment marked the beginning of a new phase of his mission. No longer merely the persecuted preacher of Mecca, Muhammad was now the head of a community, entrusted not only with guiding their worship but with governing their lives. His first priority was to build a place of prayer, and with his own hands he helped to construct the mosque, laying bricks alongside his companions. This mosque was not only a sanctuary for prayer but the center of the community, a gathering place for decisions, teaching, and fellowship. It was modest in design, built of simple materials, but it carried within it the spirit of unity that would come to define the Muslim ummah. In Medina, Muhammad also established bonds between the emigrants from Mecca, known as the Muhajirin, and the local converts of Medina, the Ansar, or helpers. These bonds were more than symbolic, they were practical ties of brotherhood meant to ease the struggles of those who had left behind their homes and livelihoods in Mecca. Each emigrant was paired with a local family, sharing food, shelter, and work. This system not only alleviated hardship but also created a sense of unity that transcended tribal and regional divisions. For a society built on lineage and clan, this was revolutionary. Faith became the bond stronger than blood, and the community began to see itself not as separate tribes but as one people under God. Yet Medina was not only home to Muslims. Jewish tribes had long lived in the city, and there were still Arabs who did not accept Muhammad's message. To ensure peace and cooperation among all, Muhammad drafted an agreement known later as the Constitution of Medina. This document, though simple, was profound for its time. It declared that all inhabitants of Medina, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, were part of one community bound to mutual defense and justice. It recognized the distinct faith of Jews while granting them protection and the freedom to practice their religion. It laid down principles of collective security, the resolution of disputes, and the sanctity of Medina as a place of peace. In essence, it was the first attempt at an Islamic form of governance, one that balanced faith with fairness and unity. Life in Medina was different from Mecca. There was more openness, more stability, and the beginnings of social organization around the teachings Muhammad conveyed. The revelations of the Qur'an in this period shifted in tone, addressing not only belief but also laws, ethics, and community life. Instructions were given about charity, inheritance, marriage, and the care of orphans. Prayer was now performed in congregation, with the call to prayer announced publicly. Fasting during the month of Ramadan was introduced, teaching the community discipline and compassion for the hungry. Almsgiving, or zakat, was made a duty, redistributing wealth and supporting the poor. The faith that had been nurtured in secrecy in Mecca was now becoming a complete way of life, guiding every aspect of existence. Still, challenges loomed. Not all in Medina welcomed Muhammad's presence. Some harbored resentment, fearing the loss of influence. Others outwardly accepted Islam but secretly opposed him, later known as the hypocrites, led by Abdullah ibn Ubay, who had hoped to become the city's leader before Muhammad arrived. Their whispers and intrigues would create difficulties, sowing distrust and division. The Jewish tribes, initially part of the Constitution of Medina, also had mixed reactions. Some cooperated, while others remained skeptical of Muhammad's prophethood. The unity of the city was fragile, and Muhammad had to navigate its complexities with patience and wisdom. Meanwhile, the Quraysh in Mecca did not forget him. His migration did not remove him from their sight, instead, it heightened their fear. They saw his new position in Medina as a growing threat, for now he was not only a preacher but the head of a community that might one day challenge their power. Caravans traveling north to Syria still passed near Medina, and the Quraysh worried that Muhammad and his followers would intercept their trade. Tensions between Mecca and Medina began to rise, setting the stage for future conflict. For the Muslims in Medina, however, this was a time of renewal. After years of persecution, they could now practice their faith freely. They prayed openly, fasted together, shared their wealth, and lived under a system of justice unlike any they had known before. Muhammad, once vulnerable in Mecca, was now a leader whose words shaped the lives of men and women daily. The foundations of the Muslim community were being laid, not in the grand palaces of empires but in the simple courtyards of Medina, where prayer mats covered the earth, and voices rose together in devotion. The Hijra was more than a physical migration, it was a migration of identity, a transformation from scattered believers into an ummah, a united people. Medina became the cradle of Islam, the place where revelation was not only heard but lived, where a community of faith grew into a society bound by justice, compassion, and the worship of God alone. Though challenges remained, and though conflict with the Quraysh loomed on the horizon, the Muslims now had a home, a leader, and a sense of purpose. In Medina, the fragile seed planted in Mecca began to grow into a tree whose branches would soon spread far beyond Arabia. In Medina, the Muslim community grew in faith and unity, but their newfound stability was shadowed by the reality that the Quraysh in Mecca remained their sworn enemies. The migration had not ended the hostility, it had only transformed it. The Quraysh could not tolerate the thought that Muhammad had not only survived their persecution but had found refuge and leadership in another city. They feared that Medina could become a base of power, threatening their trade routes and undermining their influence among the tribes of Arabia. For the Muslims, life in Medina was freer, but it was not without danger. The caravans of the Quraysh still passed nearby, and the threat of attack loomed over them. Conflict seemed inevitable, and the verses revealed to Muhammad during this time reflected this new reality. No longer were the believers told only to endure with patience, now they were granted permission to defend themselves, to fight when they were oppressed, to protect their community from annihilation. The first confrontations began with small expeditions. Groups of Muslims went out to intercept Quraysh caravans, not merely to seize goods but to weaken the power of those who had driven them from their homes and stripped them of their property. Many Muslims had left Mecca with nothing, their wealth taken or abandoned, and these raids were a way to reclaim what had been lost. Yet the Quraysh responded with anger, and tensions grew into open war. The decisive moment came in the year 624 CE, when a caravan led by Abu Sufyan, one of the prominent Quraysh leaders, was returning from Syria. Muhammad and his followers planned to intercept it, but Abu Sufyan, sensing danger, called for reinforcements from Mecca. A Quraysh army of nearly 1,000 men set out to protect the caravan, while Muhammad gathered just over 300 followers, poorly armed and ill-equipped compared to their enemies. The stage was set for the first great battle between the Muslims and the Quraysh, the Battle of Badr. The Muslims had not sought a grand confrontation, they were outnumbered more than 3-1, and their arms were meager compared to the Quraysh cavalry and armor. Yet Muhammad encouraged his companions with the promise that God was with them, that their struggle was not only for survival but for truth and justice. They camped near a series of wells, securing the water supply, while the Quraysh camped on the opposite side of the plain. The night before the battle, the Muslims prayed fervently, asking for strength. Muhammad himself spent the night in supplication, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come, knowing that if his small band was destroyed, the message of Islam might not survive. At dawn, the two sides faced one another across the desert plain. The Quraysh were confident, their numbers and weapons giving them a sense of superiority. The Muslims stood firm, determined but anxious. The battle began with duels between champions of each side, a traditional prelude to larger conflict. When these initial encounters ended, the armies clashed. Dust rose in the air, swords clashed, cries rang out, and the outnumbered Muslims fought with fierce resolve. According to the tradition, angels were sent by God to strengthen their ranks, unseen helpers who gave them courage. Whether one sees this literally or as the heightened spirit of the believers, the result was the same. The Muslims fought with extraordinary determination, and the Quraysh lines began to falter. The Quraysh, expecting an easy victory, were thrown into confusion. Some of their leaders fell, including Abu Jahl, one of Muhammad's fiercest enemies who had mocked him in Mecca and tormented his followers. The loss of their leaders broke their morale, and soon the Quraysh began to retreat, fleeing the battlefield. By the end of the day, 70 Quraysh lay dead and another 70 were taken prisoner, while the Muslims had lost only a fraction of their small force. Against all odds, the Muslims had achieved a stunning victory. The Battle of Badr was more than a military success, it was a moment that changed the course of Islam. For the believers, it was a sign that God had indeed favored them, that their struggle was not in vain, that truth would prevail over falsehood. The victory boosted their confidence and their standing among the tribes of Arabia, many of whom began to take Muhammad more seriously as a leader. For the Quraysh, it was a humiliating defeat that shattered their pride and fueled their desire for revenge. No longer could they dismiss Muhammad as a minor nuisance, he was now a political and military threat, and they would not rest until they had answered their defeat. In Medina, the victory at Badr was celebrated, but it also raised new challenges. The Muslims now had prisoners of war, and Muhammad had to decide their fate. Some were ransomed back to their families, while others were released in exchange for teaching literacy to Muslim children, reflecting the Prophet's emphasis on mercy and education even in the aftermath of battle. The community also had to grapple with the reality that war had become a part of their lives, that faith and struggle were now bound together. The revelations that followed emphasized unity, obedience, and the necessity of sacrifice, preparing the Muslims for the struggles that lay ahead. The Battle of Badr marked the emergence of the Muslim community as a force in Arabia. No longer a small band of outcasts, they were now seen as a group capable of defeating the most powerful tribe in the region. It was a victory that gave them hope, but it also ensured that the Quraysh would return with greater fury. The struggle between Mecca and Medina was far from over. For Muhammad, the victory was a confirmation of his mission, but it also deepened his responsibility. He was not only a prophet conveying revelation, he was now a commander, a statesman, a leader whose decisions would shape the destiny of his people. In the days after Badr, the Muslims walked taller, their faith stronger, their community more secure. Yet Muhammad did not allow pride to overtake them. He reminded his followers that victory was from God, not their own strength, and that humility and faith must remain at the heart of their mission. The plain of Badr, where a small band of believers had defeated a mighty army, became a symbol of divine support, a story retold for generations as proof that perseverance and trust in God could overcome even the greatest odds. The triumph at Badr echoed far beyond the battlefield, lifting the spirits of the Muslims in Medina and sending ripples of unease through Arabia. But for the Quraysh, the humiliation was unbearable. Their leaders, once confident in their dominance, had seen their finest warriors fall at the hands of those they had dismissed as weak and powerless. The memory of Badr seared their pride, and their thirst for revenge consumed them. Abu Sufyan, who had escaped with the caravan during the earlier confrontation, became determined to restore the honor of the Quraysh. He and others began preparing for a decisive strike against Medina, gathering allies, amassing weapons, and rallying the people of Mecca to avenge their losses. In Medina, Muhammad knew that the victory at Badr would not silence his enemies. Instead, it had deepened their hatred, and he warned his companions that the struggle was far from over. The revelations that came to him urged steadfastness, reminding the believers that their faith would be tested again and again. The community remained hopeful, but the shadow of retaliation loomed ever closer. In the year following Badr, the Quraysh marched north with an army 3 times the size of the one they had fielded before. Around 3,000 men, armed with cavalry and supported by women who accompanied them to urge on the fighters, advanced toward Medina with one goal: to crush Muhammad and his followers once and for all. The Muslims, numbering around 700, gathered in defense. Some argued that they should remain within the city's walls, fighting defensively, while others, especially the younger companions eager for glory after Badr, urged Muhammad to meet the Quraysh outside on the battlefield. Muhammad listened carefully, and though his own inclination was to remain in Medina, he accepted the counsel of those who wished to confront the enemy openly. The decision was made, and the Muslims marched to the slopes of Mount Uhud, just outside the city, where they prepared for battle. The morning of Uhud carried a weight different from Badr. The Muslims remembered their earlier victory, but they also knew they were fewer in number and facing a determined enemy. Muhammad positioned his forces carefully, placing a group of archers on a small hill to guard the rear, instructing them not to leave their post under any circumstances, whether victory or defeat. His strategy was meant to prevent the Quraysh cavalry from encircling the Muslim army. The archers' role was vital, and he emphasized their duty repeatedly. The battle began with fierce intensity. Once again, the courage of the Muslims surprised their opponents. They fought with resolve, striking back at the Quraysh despite being outnumbered. Slowly, the tide of battle turned in their favor, and the Quraysh began to retreat in confusion. The Muslims pressed forward, and it seemed for a moment that another great victory was at hand. But then came the turning point. Seeing the Quraysh in retreat, many of the archers abandoned their position on the hill, rushing to gather the spoils of battle despite Muhammad's command. Only a small handful remained at their post, too few to hold back the charge that followed. Khalid ibn al-Walid, a skilled commander fighting for the Quraysh who would later become one of Islam's greatest generals, saw the opening. With swift precision, he led the Quraysh cavalry around the exposed flank, attacking the Muslims from behind. The battlefield erupted into chaos. The Muslims, caught between two forces, were thrown into confusion. Panic spread, and their earlier advantage dissolved into disaster. In the midst of the chaos, Muhammad himself was targeted. Arrows flew, stones were hurled, and in the melee he was struck, his face wounded, his tooth broken, his body battered. At one point a cry went up that Muhammad had been killed, and despair nearly overwhelmed his followers. But he lived, bloodied yet standing, rallying those around him to defend themselves. They retreated toward the slopes of Uhud, gathering near him to form a protective shield. Some fought desperately to protect him, sacrificing their lives to ensure his survival. Among them were companions who stood firm even as others fled, holding the line until the Quraysh, weary from the fighting, began to withdraw. The Quraysh had not achieved total victory, but they had restored their pride. They left the field proclaiming triumph, though Medina itself remained beyond their grasp. For the Muslims, however, the day was bitter. 70 of their number had been killed, including some of their most beloved companions. Among the dead was Hamza, Muhammad's uncle, a brave and loyal defender who had stood by him through the darkest times. His death was not only a military loss but a personal grief for Muhammad, and the way his body had been mutilated by the Quraysh deepened the sorrow. The Prophet mourned his uncle with tears, and his companions grieved alongside him. The Battle of Uhud was not like Badr. It was not a story of miraculous triumph but of painful lessons. The revelation that followed reminded the believers that obedience and discipline were essential, that turning away from the Prophet's command had brought calamity. Yet it also brought words of comfort, urging them not to lose heart, not to despair, for victory and defeat alike were tests of faith. The Qur'an reminded them that even earlier prophets and their followers had suffered setbacks, and that perseverance was the true measure of belief. In Medina, the community reflected on their loss with humility. They buried their dead, tended to their wounded, and resolved to remain steadfast. Though the Quraysh had celebrated, they had not destroyed the Muslims. Muhammad still lived, and his message still endured. Uhud became a lesson carved into the memory of the community, a reminder that their cause was greater than personal glory, that discipline and trust in God were the keys to endurance. The story of Uhud, though marked by sorrow, strengthened the Muslims in a different way than Badr. Badr had taught them that victory was possible even against great odds. Uhud taught them that disobedience and pride could undo even the strongest resolve. Together, these lessons prepared them for the trials yet to come, for the struggle between Mecca and Medina was far from finished. In the dust of Uhud, with tears shed for the fallen, the Muslims came to understand more deeply the weight of their mission and the need for patience in the face of both triumph and tragedy. The aftermath of Uhud left the Muslims in Medina shaken. They had tasted victory at Badr, only to suffer painful losses at Uhud, and the memory of disobedience that had turned triumph into near disaster weighed heavily upon them. The Quraysh had regained some of their pride, yet they had not destroyed the Muslim community, and Medina still stood strong. For Muhammad and his followers, the lesson was clear: their mission was not one of easy victories, but of perseverance through trial after trial. The revelations that came in this period reminded them that setbacks were part of the path of faith, that God tested the believers not only with triumph but with hardship. They were urged to remain steadfast, to hold firmly to obedience, and to trust that in the end truth would prevail. But the danger did not come only from outside. Within Medina itself, there were those who posed a hidden threat, the hypocrites, led by Abdullah ibn Ubay. Outwardly they professed Islam, but inwardly they resented Muhammad's leadership, fearing the loss of their own influence. They whispered doubts, spread rumors, and sought to divide the believers. Their presence created tension, for though they were not openly hostile, their disloyalty was dangerous. At Uhud, some of them had even abandoned the Muslims before the battle began, weakening their ranks. Their actions revealed how fragile the unity of the community could be, and Muhammad had to navigate their influence with patience, for open conflict with them would have torn Medina apart. Beyond Medina, the Quraysh were determined to finish what they had begun. The loss at Badr and the partial victory at Uhud were not enough; they longed to wipe out the Muslims entirely. They sought allies among the tribes of Arabia, forging a coalition vast enough to crush Medina once and for all. Envoys were sent, promises were made, and slowly a confederation took shape: Quraysh from Mecca, their allies from surrounding tribes, and even some Jewish groups who had broken their earlier agreements with Muhammad. This coalition grew into a force of nearly 10,000 men, the largest army Arabia had ever seen. They marched toward Medina with the intent not only of defeating Muhammad but of exterminating his community. In Medina, the Muslims prepared as best they could. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but Muhammad devised a plan unlike anything the Arabs had seen before. One of his companions, Salman the Persian, suggested a tactic used in Persia but unknown in Arabia, digging a trench around the vulnerable parts of the city to prevent enemy cavalry from breaking through. Muhammad accepted the idea, and the Muslims labored together, digging day and night, their hands blistered, their bodies weary, but their spirits lifted by the sense of unity. Muhammad himself joined in the digging, carrying earth upon his back, encouraging his companions with words of hope. When hunger pressed upon them, they tied stones to their stomachs, yet they continued. The trench was completed just in time, a barrier that stretched across Medina's exposed frontier. When the Confederate army arrived, they were stunned to find the trench. It was unlike anything they had faced, and their cavalry, the pride of their strength, was rendered useless. For weeks they camped around Medina, unable to breach the defenses, hurling insults and arrows across the divide, testing for weaknesses but finding none. The Muslims endured the siege with patience, though supplies ran low and the cold winds of winter cut through their tents. Fear and hunger gnawed at them, but their faith held. The Qur'an described this moment vividly, how the believers were shaken and tested, yet remained firm, while the hypocrites wavered and spread fear. The siege dragged on, frustration grew among the Confederates, and divisions appeared in their ranks. The harsh weather, the failure to break through, and the exhaustion of supplies weakened their resolve. Finally, a fierce storm swept through their camp, scattering their tents, extinguishing their fires, and breaking their will. One by one, the tribes withdrew, leaving the Quraysh alone and defeated. Without a single decisive battle, Medina had withstood the mightiest force Arabia had ever gathered. The Battle of the Trench, as it came to be known, was not a victory of swords but of strategy, patience, and unity. The aftermath of the trench was profound. The Quraysh, who had sought to end Muhammad's mission once and for all, returned to Mecca humiliated and weary. Never again would they be able to muster such a coalition, and the balance of power in Arabia began to shift. For the Muslims, the victory was not only a reprieve but a turning point. They had faced annihilation and survived, proving that their community could withstand even the greatest odds. Their faith was deepened, their confidence strengthened, and their enemies disheartened. But the siege also revealed the dangers of betrayal within Medina. During the crisis, one of the Jewish tribes, the Banu Qurayza, had broken their pact with the Muslims, aligning with the Confederates. Their actions threatened the very survival of the city, for had they attacked from within while the Quraysh pressed from without, Medina would have fallen. When the siege ended, Muhammad was forced to confront this betrayal. The tribe was besieged and judged according to their own laws, which resulted in a harsh punishment that left a lasting mark on relations within the city. The events underscored how fragile alliances could be and how seriously loyalty and trust were regarded in a time of existential threat. For Muhammad and his followers, the Battle of the Trench was a moment of transformation. They had endured hunger, fear, betrayal, and overwhelming odds, yet they had emerged stronger. No longer were they a fragile community surviving from day to day. They were now recognized as a force that could not be ignored, a people whose endurance was matched by their faith. The Quraysh still stood, but their aura of dominance was fading. The Muslims had faced the greatest storm and survived, and from that survival would come the strength to take the next steps in their mission. The trench around Medina became more than a ditch in the earth, it became a symbol of resilience, of the unity of believers who dug side by side, of strategy guided by wisdom, and of faith that held firm when all seemed lost. In the silence after the Confederates withdrew, the Muslims knew that the tide of history was turning. The Quraysh had tried to bury them under the weight of Arabia's might, but instead the soil had been broken by the hands of the faithful, preparing the ground for Islam's future to grow. In the years that followed the great siege of Medina, the Muslims found themselves in a position unlike any before. The Quraysh had thrown all they had into the Confederates' campaign, yet Medina still stood, unbroken, and the aura of Quraysh dominance was beginning to fade. The Muslims were no longer merely a persecuted band of believers, they had become a recognized community, fortified by faith and bound together by shared sacrifice. And though the hostility of the Quraysh remained, there were moments when the tide of enmity was interrupted by the demands of custom and the possibility of negotiation. It was in this atmosphere that one of the most remarkable episodes of Muhammad's leadership unfolded, the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah. The time came when Muhammad and his companions longed to return to the sacred sanctuary of the Kaaba, not as warriors but as pilgrims. The Kaaba, after all, was not only the heart of Quraysh worship but a place revered across Arabia as the house built by Abraham and Ishmael, a site of pilgrimage long before Islam. For the Muslims, it was deeply painful to be barred from it, exiled from the place where they too had prayed. And so, in the year 628 CE, Muhammad set out with around 1,400 companions, not armed for war but robed in the simple white garments of pilgrimage, bringing only the sacrificial animals customary for worship. Their intention was clear, to perform the lesser pilgrimage, the umrah, peacefully and without confrontation. The Quraysh, however, were alarmed. When news reached them that Muhammad and his followers were approaching Mecca, fear spread through the city. They could not believe that Muhammad would come unarmed. To them it seemed a provocation, perhaps even a ruse. They rushed to bar his way, sending cavalry to block the roads and prevent the Muslims from entering. Tension hung heavy in the desert air, for though Muhammad's company carried no weapons of war, the possibility of bloodshed was real. Neither side wished to desecrate the sanctuary by fighting within its bounds, but neither would yield its claim. The Muslims halted at a place called Hudaybiyyah, on the outskirts of Mecca. There, negotiations began. For days envoys traveled back and forth between the Quraysh and Muhammad, voices raised in pride, suspicion, and bargaining. At one point, Muhammad's emissary Uthman ibn Affan was delayed in Mecca, and rumors spread that he had been killed. The Muslims, fearing betrayal, pledged themselves anew to their prophet under a tree, swearing to stand firm even if it meant fighting. This pledge, remembered as the pledge of the tree, strengthened their unity and their resolve. At last, a treaty was drawn. Its terms were unexpected, even disheartening at first to many Muslims. The Quraysh would not allow them to perform the pilgrimage that year. Instead, they would return to Medina but be permitted to enter Mecca the following year for 3 days of worship. A truce of 10 years was declared between the two sides, and tribes across Arabia were free to align themselves with either party. One clause particularly stung the Muslims: if a man from Mecca joined Muhammad without his guardian's permission, he must be returned, but if a Muslim left Medina for Mecca, he would not be returned. To many believers, the terms seemed unjust, humiliating even, a surrender of dignity after so much suffering. Yet Muhammad accepted them, signing the treaty with calm resolve. The wisdom of this decision soon became clear. The truce provided what war never had: space and time. For the first time since the beginning of his mission, Muhammad and his followers could live without the constant fear of immediate attack from the Quraysh. This peace, though fragile, allowed Islam to spread more rapidly than ever before. Freed from the distractions of war, Muhammad sent letters to rulers beyond Arabia, inviting them to consider the message of Islam. Within Arabia itself, tribes who had hesitated before now looked with new eyes upon a faith that had not only survived but secured recognition from its greatest enemies. Even the terms that seemed harsh began to turn in favor of the Muslims. Soon after the treaty, a young man escaped Mecca and sought refuge with Muhammad. Bound by the agreement, Muhammad returned him, though with great sorrow. But the young man fled again and, joined by others in similar situations, formed a small band on the trade routes between Mecca and Syria. They harassed Quraysh caravans so persistently that the Quraysh themselves begged Muhammad to annul that clause of the treaty. What had once seemed a humiliation became a demonstration of the Quraysh's own weakness. The Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, though controversial at the time, proved to be a turning point. The Qur'an itself described it as a clear victory, for it shifted the balance of power without a sword being raised. It legitimized Muhammad's position as the leader of a recognized community, placed the Quraysh in a defensive posture, and opened the doors for Islam to spread far beyond Medina. In the months that followed, conversions multiplied, and the influence of Muhammad extended across Arabia in ways battle alone could not have achieved. For the Muslims, Hudaybiyyah was a lesson in patience, discipline, and trust. Victory was not always found in the clash of arms. Sometimes it lay in restraint, in endurance, in wisdom that looked beyond the moment to the future. What seemed like concession became triumph, what appeared like delay became acceleration, and what felt like loss became one of the greatest gains in the history of the early Muslim community. In that quiet plain of Hudaybiyyah, with ink and parchment rather than sword and shield, the course of Islam was altered. It was no longer a fragile faith clinging to survival but a growing force, confident in its place, secure in its destiny. The Quraysh had sought to block Muhammad from the Kaaba, but in doing so they had paved the way for a peace that would bring him closer than ever to the sanctuary they guarded. The truce would not last forever, but while it endured, the message of Islam spread like fire across the sands of Arabia, preparing the way for the great transformations yet to come. After the Treaty at Hudaybiyyah, the Muslims returned to Medina with mixed emotions. Many of them had been disappointed, believing the terms too lenient, even humiliating, but Muhammad carried himself with serenity, confident that the agreement was not a defeat but a hidden victory. Time soon proved him right. The truce with the Quraysh removed the immediate threat of war and gave the Muslim community the breathing space it had long needed. Freed from constant defense, they turned their energy to spreading the message of Islam, and in those quiet years after Hudaybiyyah, the faith spread more swiftly than in all the years of conflict combined. Tribes across Arabia, seeing that Muhammad had secured peace with Mecca itself, began to approach him, sending delegations to Medina to inquire about his teachings. What had once been viewed as a small, fragile movement now stood as a recognized power, and men and women entered Islam in increasing numbers. But peace with the Quraysh was not destined to last forever. The treaty had declared that any tribe could align itself with either Mecca or Medina, and for a time this arrangement held. Yet tribal rivalry simmered, and eventually violence broke the fragile truce. One of the Quraysh's allies attacked a tribe aligned with the Muslims, killing men even in the sanctuary of the Kaaba. The victims fled to Muhammad in Medina, seeking justice, and the violation of the treaty could not be ignored. For years the Quraysh had sought to extinguish Muhammad's mission, and now, after they themselves had broken the pact, the moment had come when the balance would shift decisively. Muhammad began to prepare, not for a skirmish or a raid, but for a march that would change Arabia forever. He called upon the believers from every corner, gathering a force unlike any he had ever commanded. 10,000 men assembled in Medina, united by faith, disciplined, and ready to follow their prophet wherever he led them. This was not a band of fugitives or a fragile community clinging to survival. This was an ummah, strong, organized, and filled with confidence. As they marched toward Mecca, their numbers and their resolve made clear that the time of weakness was long past. When they reached the outskirts of Mecca, the Quraysh were struck with fear. They had never faced such a sight. For years they had persecuted Muhammad, mocked him, fought him in battle, and plotted his death, but now he stood at their gates at the head of a force too vast to resist. Yet Muhammad did not come seeking destruction. He entered the city with humility, his head bowed, riding not as a conqueror exalting in pride but as a servant of God. There was no massacre, no bloodshed. He declared a general amnesty, sparing even those who had been his fiercest enemies, save for a handful who had committed grave crimes. The people of Mecca, who had once driven him from their midst, now saw him walk through their streets in mercy rather than vengeance. His first act was to go to the Kaaba, the sanctuary that had been at the heart of his mission since the beginning. For years it had been filled with idols, 360 in all, each representing the gods of the tribes of Arabia. Muhammad entered the sacred precinct, circled the Kaaba, and with a staff in his hand struck down the idols one by one, reciting the words of revelation, "Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished." Indeed, falsehood is bound to vanish. The idols fell, and the Kaaba was restored to the worship of one God, the same God whom Abraham and Ishmael had once honored when they raised its foundations. For the Muslims, this was the fulfillment of their journey, the culmination of years of struggle and exile. The sanctuary was purified, and the central shrine of Arabia was dedicated once again to the oneness of God. The conquest of Mecca was unlike the conquests of kings and generals. There was no burning of homes, no enslavement of women and children, no indiscriminate slaughter. Instead, there was forgiveness. Muhammad declared, "Go, for you are free," pardoning even those who had once plotted his death. The mercy he showed transformed hearts more than violence ever could. Many of the Quraysh, humbled by his clemency and moved by the sight of the idols destroyed, embraced Islam. Among them were men who had fought against him in every battle, who now stood beside him as brothers in faith. With Mecca's submission, the balance of Arabia shifted entirely. The Quraysh, once the fiercest opponents of Muhammad, were now part of his community, and their leadership of the Kaaba gave Islam a central legitimacy no other tribe could challenge. Tribes across the peninsula, seeing Mecca under Muhammad's authority, began to send delegations pledging their allegiance. Within a short span, Islam spread across Arabia, not by force alone but by the power of example, of unity, and of the transformation that had begun with a man once mocked as a lone preacher in Mecca. For Muhammad, the conquest of Mecca was not a moment of arrogance but of fulfillment. He had endured persecution, exile, war, and betrayal, and now he stood in the city of his birth, victorious yet humble. The Kaaba, once defiled by idols, was cleansed and rededicated to the worship of one God, and the mission that had begun in secret with a handful of followers had grown into a movement that encompassed the heart of Arabia. It was a triumph not of pride but of faith, a victory not of vengeance but of mercy. And though the Quraysh had once sought to silence him, they now stood at his side, proclaiming the words that had been revealed to him, that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. The conquest of Mecca was the turning point after which Islam was no longer a fragile faith on the margins but the guiding force of a people united. It was the moment when the sanctuary was restored to the faith of Abraham, when falsehood was cast down, and when mercy triumphed over vengeance. From this moment forward, the message of Islam would spread not only across Arabia but beyond, carried by a people who had been shaped in the furnace of hardship and emerged as the bearers of a vision that would change the world. The conquest of Mecca did not mean the end of struggle for Muhammad and the Muslims. Though the Quraysh had submitted and the Kaaba had been cleansed of idols, Arabia was still a land of many tribes, some watching uneasily as Islam spread, others preparing to resist. For generations, tribal pride had shaped alliances and enmities, and not all were ready to accept a new order centered on Muhammad's leadership. In the immediate aftermath of Mecca's submission, one of the greatest tests came from the tribes of Hawazin and Thaqif, powerful groups who feared that Muhammad's rising influence would eclipse their own. Determined to strike before his strength grew further, they gathered a vast force and prepared to challenge him in battle. Muhammad, aware of their mobilization, marched swiftly with his companions, now joined by many of the Quraysh who had only recently embraced Islam. His army numbered over 10,000, the largest force he had ever commanded. Confidence surged among some of the Muslims, who believed that such numbers made defeat impossible. Yet Muhammad warned them against arrogance, reminding them that victory came not from numbers or strength, but from God alone. The lesson was soon to be made painfully clear. The two armies met in the valley of Hunain. At first light, as the Muslims advanced, the Hawazin and Thaqif launched a sudden ambush from the high ground, their arrows raining down in deadly volleys. Panic spread through the Muslim ranks, and many fled in confusion, retreating in fear despite their overwhelming numbers. For a moment it seemed that disaster had struck, that the victory at Mecca would be undone in a single morning. But Muhammad stood firm, refusing to retreat. He called out to his companions, urging them to return, reminding them of their pledge and their faith. Slowly, the Muslims rallied around him, regaining their courage, pressing forward with renewed determination. The tide of battle shifted, and the enemy lines broke under the counterattack. The Muslims pursued them, capturing their camp and seizing immense spoils, including women, children, and livestock in great numbers. The Battle of Hunain was both a victory and a lesson. It reminded the believers that pride and reliance on numbers could lead to weakness, while trust in God and steadfastness brought success. The Qur'an later recorded that day, describing how the Muslims had been dazzled by their numbers but shaken until God's help descended and steadied their hearts. The spoils of Hunain were immense, and Muhammad distributed them with wisdom, giving generously to the Quraysh leaders who had only recently entered Islam, binding their loyalty to the new community. Some of the older Muslims felt uneasy at this, wondering why those who had once opposed Islam received such gifts, but Muhammad explained that it was to soften their hearts, to strengthen the bonds of unity. His vision was not only of battle but of reconciliation, weaving together the tribes into a single fabric. In the months that followed, delegations from across Arabia came to Medina, pledging allegiance, embracing Islam, or seeking treaties. One by one, the tribes submitted, not only because of military strength but because they saw in Muhammad's leadership justice, mercy, and a vision greater than tribal rivalry. Idols were toppled from sanctuaries across the peninsula, and the worship of one god spread from town to town, village to village, until it encompassed nearly all of Arabia. The Quraysh, once the fiercest enemies of Islam, became its guardians, their custodianship of the Kaaba now tied forever to the worship of God alone. As Islam spread, Muhammad prepared for what would become one of the most significant moments of his mission, the pilgrimage to Mecca performed in the pure form of Abraham's tradition. In the year 632 CE, he set out with tens of thousands of followers to perform the rites of the Hajj. For many, it was their first time witnessing the pilgrimage without idols, the Kaaba cleansed and dedicated solely to the worship of God. Standing before the gathered multitude on the plain of Arafat, Muhammad delivered what came to be known as his farewell sermon. In it, he reminded the people of the sanctity of life and property, of the equality of all believers regardless of race or lineage, declaring that no Arab was superior to a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab to an Arab, except in piety. He commanded them to treat women with kindness, to fulfill their trusts, to avoid the injustices of ignorance that had marked the old tribal ways. And he proclaimed that he had conveyed the message entrusted to him, leaving them with the Qur'an as their guide. The farewell pilgrimage was not only a ritual but a culmination, a moment when the mission that had begun in secret with a handful of followers was now proclaimed before tens of thousands united in faith. Muhammad's words carried the weight of finality, as though he sensed that his time among them was drawing to a close. His companions wept, moved by the realization that this might be his last address, and they clung to his guidance with hearts full of both sorrow and gratitude. In these final years, Muhammad's role had expanded beyond anything his people could have imagined when he first called them to abandon their idols. He was now not only a prophet but the leader of a unified Arabia, the arbiter of disputes, the commander of armies, the teacher of law, and the living example of the faith he preached. Yet despite the power that had come to him, he lived with humility, sleeping on a simple mat, mending his own clothes, eating plain food, and reminding his followers that this world was fleeting, that the true reward lay in the life to come. His greatness was not in wealth or luxury but in the way he embodied the message he had delivered. The years after Mecca's conquest and the Battle of Hunain marked the final consolidation of Islam in Arabia. What had once seemed impossible had been achieved, the tribes united, the Kaaba purified, and the pilgrimage restored to its original sanctity. But even as the community grew stronger, Muhammad's earthly life neared its end. His farewell words at Arafat echoed in the hearts of his followers, preparing them for the moment when they would have to carry his mission without him, guided only by the Qur'an and the memory of his example. In the months after the farewell pilgrimage, Muhammad returned to Medina with a sense of completeness, as though the mission entrusted to him had reached its fullness. Arabia, once divided by tribal feuds and idolatry, was now united under the worship of one God. The Kaaba, cleansed of its idols, stood once again as the sanctuary of Abraham's faith. The Qur'an had been revealed in its entirety, guiding the people in matters of belief, worship, law, and conduct. His companions, once few and persecuted, were now tens of thousands, carrying the message to their families, their tribes, and the far corners of the land. For Muhammad, who had once walked the streets of Mecca mocked and rejected, the transformation was complete. Yet even as the community flourished, his own body began to weaken. In the year 632 CE, during the last months of his life, Muhammad began to feel the weight of illness. At first it was a fever that gripped him, his body aching, his strength waning. He continued to lead prayers and guide his companions, but his weakness grew more apparent. In his final days, he sought comfort in the homes of his wives, moving from one to another until at last he asked to remain in the room of Aisha, the youngest of his wives, where he spent his last moments. There he lay upon a simple bed, his head resting against her chest, as the fever took hold of him. Even in illness, his concern was not for himself but for his people. He urged them to remain steadfast in prayer, to treat one another with kindness, to uphold the unity of the ummah. At times he rose to lead the prayer, supported by others when his body could no longer carry him. When his strength failed, he appointed Abu Bakr, his closest friend and the first adultman to embrace Islam, to lead the community in prayer. It was a sign of the trust he placed in Abu Bakr and a foreshadowing of the role he would take after Muhammad's passing. In his final hours, Muhammad's companions gathered around the mosque, their hearts heavy with grief. They could not imagine life without him, the men who had been their guide, their teacher, their leader, and their beloved prophet. Many prayed fervently, hoping for his recovery, but he himself seemed to know that his time had come. According to Aisha, his final moments were spent whispering prayers, calling upon God, and urging his followers to remember their duty to him. He lifted his hand toward the heavens, uttering words of devotion, and then his voice grew still. On that day, in the 11th year after the Hijrah, Muhammad, the messenger of God, passed away. The shock that gripped Medina was overwhelming. News of his death spread through the city like a wave of sorrow. Some of his companions could not accept it. Umar, strong and fierce in his loyalty, stood before the people and declared that Muhammad had not died, that he had only gone to his Lord as Moses had gone and would return. His grief was so great that he threatened those who claimed otherwise. But Abu Bakr, with calm and clarity, stood before the people and recited the verse of the Qur'an, "Muhammad is but a messenger. Messengers have passed away before him. If he dies or is killed, will you turn back on your heels?" The words settled upon the crowd like a truth they could not deny. Umar himself sank in sorrow as he realized that the Prophet had indeed left them. The mourning that followed was profound. Men and women wept openly in the streets, unable to contain their grief. They remembered his gentleness, his kindness, his patience, his smile. They recalled how he had walked among them without pride, how he had shared their hardships, how he had comforted them in sorrow and guided them in faith. His death was not only the loss of a leader but of a father to the community, a light whose presence had illuminated their lives. He was buried in the very room where he had died, in Aisha's chamber, and over the years a mosque would grow around his resting place, becoming one of the holiest sites in Islam. With his passing, the weight of responsibility fell upon the community. The Qur'an was complete, the guidance clear, but the leadership of the ummah had to be entrusted to human hands. The companions gathered and pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr as the first caliph, the successor to the Prophet's leadership, though not to his prophethood. His task would be to preserve the unity of the Muslims and to continue the mission Muhammad had left them. It was a heavy burden, but it was carried forward with the memory of the Prophet's example always before them. The final illness and passing of Muhammad marked the end of his earthly journey, but his legacy was only beginning. His life, from orphan child to trusted merchant, from persecuted preacher to prophet of God, had transformed Arabia. His words, preserved in the Qur'an and in the memory of his companions, would guide generations to come. His example of mercy, humility, and justice would be remembered not only by those who knew him but by billions who would follow in his path. For his companions, the grief of his loss was tempered by the knowledge that he had fulfilled his mission, leaving them with a faith that would endure beyond his lifetime. The room in which he passed grew silent after his departure, but the city of Medina, and soon the world, would resound with the words he had brought. That there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. His death closed one chapter but opened another, as the message entrusted to him began to spread beyond Arabia, carried by those who had once wept at his bedside but who now carried his legacy into lands he had never seen. When the Prophet passed from this world, the grief of the community in Medina was overwhelming, but even in their mourning the reality of leadership could not be delayed. The Muslims were now united as a people, yet without the Prophet's presence there was an urgent need to decide who would guide them, who would preserve their unity, and who would carry forward the mission that had been entrusted to them. This was not an easy task, for Muhammad had left no son to inherit leadership, nor had he named a successor in explicit terms. He had shown signs of his trust in Abu Bakr when he appointed him to lead prayers during his illness, but the matter of political leadership required the consensus of the community. The Ansar, the helpers of Medina who had welcomed Muhammad during the Hijrah and supported him in battle, gathered to discuss the future. They proposed that one of their own should lead, since they had provided the Prophet with refuge and protection when Mecca had rejected him. The Muhajirin, those who had migrated from Mecca, understood the argument but believed that leadership should remain with them, for the Quraysh held authority and respect among the Arabs, and it was through them that Islam had first taken root. Tensions might have risen to division had it not been for the wisdom of Abu Bakr. He reminded the people that they were one ummah, bound not by tribe but by faith, and that leadership should rest with those best suited to it, not simply by lineage or pride. He proposed Umar or Abu Ubaidah, both respected companions, but Umar immediately took Abu Bakr's hand and pledged allegiance to him, declaring that none was more deserving than the men whom the Prophet himself had entrusted with leading prayers. The others followed, and Abu Bakr was chosen as the first caliph, the successor to the Prophet's leadership in worldly matters. This moment was crucial, for it preserved the unity of the Muslims at a time when division could have destroyed everything Muhammad had built. Abu Bakr, though modest and gentle, accepted the responsibility with humility, reminding the people in his first address that he was not above them but among them, and that if he erred they must correct him. "The weak among you shall be strong with me until I secure his right," he said, "and the strong among you shall be weak with me until I take from him what is due." His words reflected the justice that had been central to Muhammad's teaching and set the tone for his rule. Yet even as unity was preserved in Medina, challenges arose across Arabia. Many tribes that had pledged allegiance to Muhammad during his lifetime now wavered. Some believed their loyalty had been only to him personally and saw no reason to continue after his death. Others sought to return to the old ways, abandoning the obligations of prayer and charity. False prophets also arose, men who claimed revelation for themselves and sought to rally tribes around their own leadership. Arabia, only recently united, seemed poised to fracture once again. Abu Bakr faced these crises with resolve. Though some companions urged him to be lenient, he insisted that Islam could not be abandoned piece by piece. The obligation of zakat, the giving of alms, was as central as prayer, and those who refused it were defying the very structure of the faith. He declared that he would fight even if people withheld a rope they once gave in charity, for he saw in these rebellions a threat to the unity of the ummah. The wars that followed, known as the Ridda, or Wars of Apostasy, were fierce and bloody. But under Abu Bakr's leadership, the Muslims persevered, quelling the rebellions, defeating the false prophets, and restoring unity to Arabia. It was during this period too that the preservation of the Qur'an became urgent. Many of those who had memorized large portions of the revelation fell in battle during the Ridda Wars, and Umar feared that without action, the words entrusted to Muhammad might be lost. He urged Abu Bakr to commission a compilation, gathering the revelations from memory, parchment, and bones into a single record. At first Abu Bakr hesitated, for the Prophet had not done so, but he recognized the necessity. Zayd ibn Thabit, who had served as a scribe for the Prophet, was chosen to lead the effort. With care and diligence, he collected the verses, cross-checking with those who had memorized them, preserving the Qur'an in written form. This compilation, later standardized under Uthman, became the foundation upon which the words of revelation would be transmitted without alteration across generations. Abu Bakr's caliphate was short, lasting only about 2 years, but in that time he safeguarded the unity of the Muslims, suppressed rebellion, preserved the Qur'an, and prepared the community for the expansion that would follow. He sent expeditions north into Byzantine and Persian lands, signaling that Islam was no longer confined to Arabia but would reach beyond its borders. When his health began to fail, he appointed Umar as his successor, ensuring a smooth transition and preventing the disputes that might have fractured the ummah again. For the companions who had loved Muhammad, the grief of his loss was still fresh, but in the leadership of Abu Bakr they found stability and reassurance. Though no one could replace the Prophet, the community endured, guided by the principles he had taught and by the memory of his example. The immediate aftermath of his death could have led to disintegration, but instead it became the foundation of continuity, the moment when Islam proved that it was not the faith of one man's lifetime but a way of life that would outlast him and spread far beyond the land of his birth. The Prophet's passing had been the greatest trial, but his legacy endured in the faith, in the Qur'an, in the unity of the believers, and in the leadership that carried his mission forward. What had begun in secret whispers in Mecca, what had survived exile, battle, and hardship, now stood unshaken, poised to move beyond Arabia into the world. With the death of Abu Bakr and the appointment of Umar as the second caliph, the community entered a new phase of history, one in which Muhammad's legacy began to ripple far beyond the deserts of Arabia. Umar was a man of immense strength, both in body and in spirit, known for his fierce temperament before Islam and his unwavering sense of justice after embracing the faith. He had once been among the harshest opponents of Muhammad, but after his conversion he became one of the Prophet's most devoted supporters, standing firm at his side in moments of peril and speaking with a clarity that cut through doubt. Abu Bakr, recognizing his qualities, entrusted him with the leadership of the ummah, and with Umar's ascension the Muslims entered an era of extraordinary transformation. Umar's caliphate was marked not only by internal stability but also by unprecedented expansion. Under his command, the Muslims moved beyond Arabia, confronting two of the great powers of the world, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sasanian Empire in the east. These empires had long overshadowed Arabia, their armies, wealth, and city symbols of might beyond comparison. Yet they were weakened by years of war with each other, and into that vacuum of exhaustion the Muslims advanced, disciplined by faith, inspired by the memory of Mohammed, and guided by commanders who had learned patience, unity, and trust in God. The campaigns against the Byzantines brought the Muslims into Syria and Palestine. At battles like Yarmouk, they faced immense armies but prevailed through determination and tactical brilliance. Khalid ibn al-Walid, once a commander of Quraysh who had fought against Muhammad, now stood as one of the greatest generals of Islam, leading the Muslims with courage and skill. The victory at Yarmouk in 636 CE shattered Byzantine control over the Levant, and within a short time cities like Damascus and Jerusalem opened their gates. When Jerusalem surrendered, Umar himself traveled to the city to accept its submission. He entered humbly, dressed simply, refusing the pomp of rulers. The Christians of the city were granted protection, their churches preserved, and the sanctity of their holy places respected. Umar prayed on the Temple Mount but declined to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, fearing that future Muslims might take his act as a precedent to seize it. His wisdom ensured that the city's diverse faiths would continue to worship side by side. To the east, the Muslims confronted the Sasanian Empire, whose vast wealth and mighty armies had dominated Persia for centuries. Yet at battles like Qadisiyah and Nahavand, the Muslims achieved astonishing victories. The Persians, though numerous and well-armed, were divided and weary, and the Muslims' unity gave them the strength to endure. With the fall of Ctesiphon, the great Persian capital, treasures beyond imagination came into Muslim hands, but Umar was cautious. He wept when he saw the wealth, reminding the believers that these riches were a test, not a reward, and that humility must never be abandoned. He refused to indulge in luxury, living as simply as he always had, wearing patched clothes, eating coarse bread, and sleeping on a mat of palm fibers. His life was a living reminder of the Prophet's example. Under Umar, the expansion was not only military but also administrative. He established systems of governance, creating a register for soldiers, organizing stipends for the poor, and setting up markets regulated by fairness. He ensured that conquered peoples were treated with justice, granting protection to Christians, Jews, and others under Muslim rule, in exchange for a tax that exempted them from military service. Many were astonished by the fairness they received, especially compared to the heavy burdens of their previous rulers. The new rule was not without difficulty, but it brought a measure of justice and stability that impressed even those who did not embrace Islam. The legacy of Muhammad was visible everywhere in Umar's leadership. He constantly reminded the people that they were servants of God, not conquerors for their own pride. He walked the streets of Medina at night, checking on the condition of the poor, ensuring that no one went hungry. He carried food on his back to widows and orphans, saying that if he did not care for them, then he was unworthy of his office. His humility was so great that when emissaries came from distant lands, they sometimes struggled to identify him, for he had no throne, no crown, and no guards, only a patched cloak and a staff. But his caliphate was not without sorrow. Toward the end of his life, Umar was struck by an assassin, a slave who held a grievance, and he succumbed to his wounds in 644 CE. As he lay dying, he appointed a council to choose his successor, ensuring that the leadership would remain stable. His death was mourned deeply, for he had taken the fragile community that had once been confined to Medina and transformed it into a civilization stretching from the Nile to the Tigris, from Jerusalem to Persia. The Caliphate of Umar was remembered as one of justice, humility, and expansion, a time when Muhammad's message moved far beyond Arabia and began to shape the world. The Qur'an and the Prophet's example were the foundation upon which he built, and though the conquests were vast, he never allowed the people to forget that their mission was not for wealth or glory but for the worship of one God and the establishment of justice. Under his leadership, Islam ceased to be merely the faith of Arabia, it became a world faith, a guiding light that would influence countless peoples and generations. The Prophet's words, his humility, his vision of justice, all echoed in Umar's rule, ensuring that even as the empire grew, the memory of its founder remained alive in every act of fairness, every moment of humility, every instance of unity that bound the community together. The expansion of Islam under Umar was not simply the spread of territory but the unfolding of Muhammad's legacy into lands he had never seen, ensuring that his message would live on not just in Arabia but across continents. With the passing of Umar, the ummah once again faced the task of choosing its leader, and the responsibility was not taken lightly. A council appointed by Umar considered the matter and ultimately selected Uthman ibn Affan, one of the earliest companions of Muhammad and a man known for his gentleness, piety, and generosity. Uthman was from the powerful Umayyad clan of Quraysh, a tribe that had once opposed Islam bitterly but now stood within its embrace. His wealth had supported the Muslim community in its early days, funding expeditions, equipping armies, and providing relief for the poor. With his ascension, the caliphate entered a new stage, one defined by both remarkable achievements and profound challenges. One of Uthman's most enduring legacies was his role in standardizing the Qur'an. During the Prophet's lifetime, the revelation had been memorized by many companions and written on various materials, but it had not yet been compiled into a single, universally recognized text. Abu Bakr had initiated the first collection after the Ridda Wars, when many of those who had memorized the Qur'an fell in battle, and Umar had safeguarded this collection during his caliphate. But as Islam spread far beyond Arabia into lands of different dialects and tongues, differences in recitation began to arise, threatening confusion. Uthman, recognizing the danger of division, ordered a standard copy to be prepared under the supervision of Zayd ibn Thabit and other trusted scribes. This copy, written in the Quraysh dialect, was sent to every major center of the empire, and other versions were destroyed to preserve unity. This act ensured that the Qur'an would remain consistent across generations and lands, unaltered and preserved as it had been revealed. For Muslims, this was among Uthman's greatest achievements, a fulfillment of the Prophet's mission to preserve God's word without corruption. At the same time, Uthman presided over the continued expansion of the Muslim state. Under his rule, the empire stretched into North Africa, across Armenia, and deeper into Persia. Fleets were built, and the Muslims began to master the seas, defeating Byzantine forces in naval battles that extended their reach to Cyprus and beyond. Cities flourished under new administration, and the wealth that flowed into Medina was greater than anything the Arabs had ever known. But with this wealth came new challenges. The simplicity of the Prophet's time began to give way to luxury in some quarters, and the vast distances of the empire made governance increasingly complex. It was here that the cracks began to appear. Uthman was known for his kindness and reluctance to act harshly, but his generosity to members of his own Umayyad family drew criticism. He appointed relatives to positions of power, and though many served capably, others abused their authority, leading to resentment among distant provinces. Complaints arose from Egypt, Kufa, and Basra, where people accused some of Uthman's governors of corruption or favoritism. While Uthman often tried to mediate, recalling or admonishing governors, his leniency was seen by some as weakness. Discontent grew, not only among ordinary people but even among some companions of the Prophet, who feared that the principles of justice and equality Muhammad had taught were being eroded. The tension deepened until it could no longer be contained. Delegations of protesters came to Medina, demanding reforms and the removal of certain governors. Uthman listened, agreed to some changes, and sent letters of instruction, but a mysterious twist inflamed matters. Some protesters claimed they intercepted a letter, allegedly sealed with Uthman's name, ordering reprisals against them. Whether the letter was forged or sent without his knowledge remains debated, but the damage was done. Outrage boiled over, and rebels surrounded Uthman's house in Medina. For weeks he was besieged, yet he refused to shed Muslim blood, ordering his supporters not to fight the rebels on his behalf. As the siege dragged on, Uthman turned to the Qur'an for comfort, reciting its verses as he endured hunger, thirst, and isolation. In the end, the rebels broke into his home and killed him as he sat with the Qur'an before him. His blood stained the sacred text, a haunting image of a caliph who had given his life to preserve the unity of the Qur'an now dying with its words in his lap. His death shocked the Muslim world and marked the beginning of one of the most painful chapters in the community's history. The assassination of Uthman was not simply the fall of a caliph, it was the shattering of consensus. For the first time, Muslims had turned their swords against one another, and the unity that Muhammad had so carefully nurtured was threatened from within. His death unleashed disputes over leadership, justice, and power that would ripple for generations, shaping the future of Islam in ways that neither Uthman nor his companions could have foreseen. Yet even amid this turmoil, Uthman's contributions endured. The Qur'an as it exists today, recited and revered by millions across the world, carries his imprint in its standardized form. His expansion of the empire carried Muhammad's message into lands the Prophet had never walked, and his personal generosity left countless Muslims indebted to his support in the early years. His gentleness, though exploited by his enemies, reflected a heart shaped by faith and devotion. The Caliphate of Uthman revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Muslim community. It showed how far Islam had spread in just 2 decades after the Prophet's death, reaching lands once unimaginable to the people of Mecca and Medina. But it also revealed how power and wealth could strain the bonds of unity, and how human weakness could threaten the divine mission. For the companions who still lived, the sorrow of Uthman's murder was profound, for they had seen with their own eyes the Prophet's mercy and justice, and now they saw division where once there had been unity. Uthman's martyrdom left the Caliphate in crisis, and the ummah stood at a crossroads. The leadership passed next to Ali ibn Abi Talib, cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, a man revered for his courage, knowledge, and closeness to the Prophet. But his rule would unfold in the shadow of Uthman's death, and the disputes it unleashed would grow into the first civil war among Muslims, a conflict that would shape their history for centuries to come. With the death of Uthman, the Muslim community was thrust into a crisis unlike any it had faced before. For years, the unity of the ummah had been preserved despite external enemies and internal challenges, but now, for the first time, Muslims themselves had shed the blood of their leader. The shock of Uthman's assassination reverberated across the empire, leaving anger, grief, and uncertainty in its wake. In Medina, the people turned to Ali ibn Abi Talib, cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, renowned for his bravery, knowledge, and closeness to Muhammad. Ali at first hesitated, for he knew the burden he was being asked to carry, but eventually he accepted the role of caliph, recognizing that the community could not remain leaderless in so dangerous a time. Ali was deeply respected, not only for his kinship with the Prophet but for his character. He had been among the earliest to embrace Islam, had fought in nearly every battle at Muhammad's side, and was known for his wisdom and eloquence. Yet his accession was immediately shadowed by the unresolved question of Uthman's murder. Many demanded swift justice, particularly the Umayyads, Uthman's powerful relatives, who accused Ali of failing to punish the killers decisively. Ali argued that justice could not be rushed while chaos still gripped Medina, for acting hastily might tear the community apart even further. But this caution, though wise, left space for resentment to grow. The tension erupted into open conflict. Some of the Prophet's companions, including Aisha, Talha, and Zubair, who had long been pillars of the early community, opposed Ali's leadership and marched against him, believing he had not done enough to avenge Uthman. The two sides met at Basra in what became known as the Battle of the Camel, named for the camel upon which Aisha rode as she directed her forces. The battle was fierce and tragic, pitting Muslims against Muslims, men who had once prayed shoulder to shoulder now facing each other with swords drawn. When the fighting ended, Ali emerged victorious, but the victory was bitter, for it had come at the cost of Muslim blood spilled by their own hands. Ali treated Aisha with respect, sending her back to Medina under escort, but the wound to the unity of the Ummah was deep. More conflict followed, most notably the confrontation with Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and relative of Uthman, who demanded vengeance for the slain caliph. Their forces clashed at Siffin in a prolonged battle that ended in arbitration, a compromise that left neither side satisfied and further weakened Ali's authority. From this turmoil arose a group known as the Kharijites, who broke away from Ali's camp altogether, denouncing both him and Muawiyah, and declaring that leadership belonged only to those who ruled with absolute justice as they interpreted it. Their extremism became a new source of violence, further fracturing the community. Ali's caliphate was thus consumed by civil strife, remembered as the first fitna, or great trial, a period of division and sorrow in which the unity Muhammad had nurtured seemed to unravel. Ali himself remained steadfast, striving for justice, living with the humility and devotion that had always marked his character. He walked among the people without guards, lived simply, and judged disputes with fairness, earning admiration even from those who opposed his rule. But his enemies grew, and in the year 661 CE, as he entered the mosque in Kufa for prayer, he was struck by an assassin's blade. His death, like that of Uthman, was a martyrdom, and it left the community once again in grief and turmoil. With Ali's passing, the caliphate passed to Muawiyah, who established the Umayyad dynasty and shifted the seat of power to Damascus. This marked the beginning of a new era, in which the leadership of the Muslims became dynastic, moving further from the simplicity of Muhammad's time. The divisions that had emerged during Ali's caliphate deepened into lasting schisms, particularly between those who revered Ali and his family as the rightful leaders and those who accepted the authority of the caliphs who followed. These divisions would shape the history of Islam for centuries, giving rise to enduring differences in theology, practice, and identity. Yet even in the midst of conflict, the legacy of Muhammad endured. His message, his teachings, and the Qur'an he had conveyed continued to guide the lives of believers across the expanding empire. Islam spread far beyond Arabia, carried by traders, scholars, and travelers, reaching into Africa, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. The companions of the Prophet, though divided in politics, continued to transmit his sayings and deeds, preserving the memory of his life as an example for generations to come. The empire that grew from his mission became one of the great civilizations of history, fostering advances in science, art, law, and philosophy, all rooted in the faith he had proclaimed. The story of Ali's caliphate, and the conflicts that followed Muhammad's passing, serves as a reminder of the humanity of the community he left behind. They were men and women striving to uphold divine guidance, yet also struggling with their own weaknesses, ambitions, and fears. The Prophet had united them with a vision of justice, mercy, and devotion, and though divisions arose, his example remained the constant thread, the anchor that bound believers to the truth he had taught. The 20 parts of this story have traced Muhammad's life from his birth in Mecca to the struggles and triumphs of his mission, through his passing and the legacy carried forward by his companions. His life was one of humility, perseverance, and faith, his message one of oneness and justice, his example one that continues to inspire more than 1 billion people today. The trials that followed his death, the divisions and conflicts, were part of the human struggle to live up to the ideals he embodied. Yet despite them, the light he kindled has never been extinguished. His words remain recited, his teachings studied, his name honored, and his message alive, carried in the hearts of those who continue to testify that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger.